You blinked, and China took another step towards the domain of the seas. Satellite images show the accelerated expansion of the Qingdao naval base in the northeast of the country, and it is no coincidence. Beijing is building the necessary infrastructure to receive its new and powerful aircraft carrier. But after all, why so much interest in this type of vessel? What is behind this billionaire investment? In this video, we will reveal how and why China is betting heavily on the aircraft carriers and what it means to balance forces in the oceans of the world. Long before they appeared on international headlines, China's naval plans were already being sown quietly. It all started shyly in the 80s and 90s, when the country was still seen mostly as a terrestrial power. At that moment, while many saw China as a growing economy and nothing more, Beijing was beginning to realize the importance of the sea in its strategic projection. And the first step? By disabled aircraft carrier. Not to use in combat, but to study. These vessels, often considered obsolete, have become true floating laboratories. Chinese engineers dismantled these peace ships by piece, studying their compartments, propulsion systems, flight deck, internal structure. It was a process of thorough and silent learning. China was in no hurry. She wanted to understand deeply how an aircraft carrier worked before risking building or operating one. This strategic patience would begin to bear fruit years later. The game of the game took place in 1998, when China bought the unfinished hull of the Soviet Karta Tryag, which was abandoned in Ukraine. Officially, the speech was that the ship would be transformed into a floating casino. But behind this unusual excuse was an extremely calculated movement. Variag transport to Chinese shipyards was a complex and time-long logistics operation. But once in Chinese territory, that rusty hull began to make a new life. More than a decade later, in 2012, he was reborn with a new name, Liaoning, and with a new purpose, to serve as China's first aircraft carrier. But Liaoning was not created to be a weapon of war immediately. He was thought of as a school, a test platform where the Chinese Navy could train maneuvers, understand the operation of embedded aircraft, simulate naval combat, and develop its own doctrines. This was the first concrete step, the beginning of a new era. But what would come would show the world that China was not just testing. It was preparing to become a real naval power. Liaoning in operation, China now experienced the routine of an aircraft combat group. Whole crews were trained, pilots specialized in offspring and difficult landings on a moving deck, and the country's naval facilities began to be adapted to receive and support an aircraft carrier. And it was precisely this learning curve that paved the way for a new technological leap. The launch of Shandong in 2019. Unlike Liaoning, Shandong was entirely built in China, based on the experience gained with the first ship. He brought significant improvements in internal layout, hangar capacity, and aircraft operation. Now it was no longer trying to test or train. China had built a zero aircraft carrier with a real combat capacity. This breakthrough has not gone unnoticed. Military analysts in the West began to review their projections. The Chinese Navy, once considered a regional force, was beginning to show global ambitions. But what came later left the most skeptical warning. In 2022, the world met Fujian, the most advanced Chinese aircraft carrier so far. He was not just bigger or more beautiful, was technologically revolutionary. For the first time, China adopted electromagnetic catapults for the launch of aircraft, a technology that until then only the United States had been able to successfully develop. This system replaces the old steam mechanisms and allows planes to take off with total fuel load and weapons, which dramatically increases combat efficiency. With this, Fujian has become the symbol of a new era of the Chinese Navy, a force that not only learns but innovates, a force capable of designing power over long distances, sustaining complex operations, and quickly responding to international crises. But to operate aircraft carrier with this level of sophistication, it is not enough to build the ships. You must have a whole support infrastructure. And this is where the expansion of the Yuchi Naval Base comes in the city of Qingdao. Recent images show large-scale works. New piers, hangars, supply and maintenance areas, all designed to accommodate multiple aircraft carriers at the same time. The base is being shaped to be the logistical and operational brain of the Chinese aircraft fleet. And this expansion is not by chance. The plan is clear, creating the ability to operate simultaneously 2 or even 3 groups of aircraft carrier. Something that, until today, only the United States can do with global effectiveness. China wants to change that and is getting closer to achieving. This accelerated transformation of the Chinese Navy is not limited to the construction of aircraft carrier. It involves a broad strategic vision focused on the concept of blue waters. That is, a naval force capable of operating globally, away from the national territory, and maintaining constant presence in regions of interest. To support this ambition, Beijing has expanded not only the amount of his ships, but the quality and specialization of each class. Frigates, freshers, submarines, and support ships are being produced at an industrial rhythm, forming what experts call the largest navy in number of units in the world. But the number by itself is not enough. Chinese operational doctrine also evolved. Contrary to the past, where the Popular Liberation Army Navy was seen as a coastal force with defensive focus, today it is trained for offensive actions, with a projection capacity in multiple operating theaters. Naval exercises on the high seas have become commonplace. Chinese task groups already cross the Indian Ocean, pass through the Suez Canal, and appear in the Mediterranean Sea or the back of Africa. The Chinese presence is already a reality on strategic bases such as Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, and negotiations are underway to install support points in countries such as Cambodia, UAE, and even Argentina. Each new base is a step on the board of naval geopolitics. In this scenario, the aircraft carriers gain even more importance. They are both weapons and symbols at the same time. Weapons because they allow launching planes anywhere on the planet, offering surveillance, air defense, and attack with enormous flexibility. And symbols because they represent status, the entry of a country in the select group of the global projection naval powers. And that is exactly what China seeks. Its strategy is based on the idea of anti-descent and area denial, where aircraft carriers do not act in isolation, but integrated into a satellite ecosystem, long-range anti-villain missiles, drones, and submarines. The goal is clear: to dissuade the presence of enemy fleets near their strategic surroundings, especially the US in the Western Pacific. The competition between Washington and Beijing in the naval domain is no longer theory. It's an ongoing dispute, and Chinese aircraft carriers are key pieces of this game. But to take the next step, China knows that it needs to exceed a fundamental limit: autonomy. Its current aircraft carriers depend on constant refueling and are limited in operational range. And it is precisely at this point that the most ambitious project arises so far: Type 004. Since the 80s and 90s, China has invested in learning and developing aircraft carrier, buying disabled ships for technical and operational study. This silent but strategic process began with a series of old vessel acquisitions, such as Australia's MAS Melbourne, dismantled for structural analysis. The first big leap was the acquisition of the Soviet Karta Tryag hull in 1998. At the time, it was unfinished and rusty, abandoned after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Officially, the purchase was made by a civil company that promised to turn it into a floating casino. But the hull was discreetly taken to the Dalian shipyard, where it underwent a profound reform. In 2012, he was commissioned as Liaoning, the first Chinese Navy handbook. Liaoning is not designed for intense combat, but as a test platform. It allowed China to develop operational doctrine, enable naval pilots, to create specialized crews, and build the necessary infrastructure to operate and maintain aircraft carrier. It was essential to establish the foundations of a much more ambitious program. In 2019, China revealed Shandong, its first aircraft carrier fully built internally. Based on the experience obtained with Liaoning, Shandong has significant improvements in organizing the flight deck, control systems, and operating conditions, even maintaining the ramp system, SKI jump, for takeoffs. The big leap came in 2022 with the launch of Fujian, a new generation aircraft carrier. Unlike the previous ones, Fujian abandoned the takeoff ramp and adopted electromagnetic catapults, a technology that until then only the United States had implemented in its most modern aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford. This technology allows planes to take off with maximum fuel load and weapons, exponentially increasing the offensive and defensive capacity of the battle group. In addition, Fujian is larger, more automated, and represents a qualitative leap in the Chinese naval industry. At the same time, China has expanded Yuqi's naval base in Qingdao, building new docks capable of housing large warships and their escorts. The idea is to allow simultaneous operations of multiple aircraft carrier groups, something that until today, only the United States has been able to perform effectively. And ambition doesn't stop there. The construction of Type 004 has already begun, the future Chinese nuclear aircraft carrier. Nuclear propulsion will eliminate constant replenishment dependence, allowing long-term missions with global range and greater permanence at sea. It will undoubtedly be a watershed for the Chinese naval presence. With these steps, Beijing's ultimate goal is becoming increasingly evident: to compete equally with the US in projection of naval power, using their aircraft carrier as instruments of deterrent, military presence, and strategic influence on all oceans. The sea is no longer a defensive wall for China. Now it is the stage of its ascension.